What happened to Lynette Hooker? What happened to your wife, Brian Hooker? Because she didn't bounce off the back of your dinghy and then suddenly get lost in the giant seas and the current and the waves and the tide. All that stuff didn't happen.
What happened to Lynette Hooker in the dark, shallow waters of the Sea of Abaco is a question that has haunted investigators for weeks, but the answer may have just been rewritten by an overnight security guard standing on a quiet dock in the Bahamas. For over a month, Brian Hooker has maintained a highly specific, tragic narrative regarding the night his 55-year-old wife vanished from their small, 8-foot dinghy. He claimed that as they were navigating back to their anchor site, unexpected rough seas, high winds, and a sudden lurch caused Lynette to bounce off the back of the small vessel and plunge into the water. In a twist that seemed uniquely catastrophic, Brian claimed that Lynette was holding the dry bag containing the engine safety lanyard and the keys to the outboard motor. When she fell, the lanyard snapped away, immediately killing the engine, leaving Brian powerless to steer, throttle, or return to the exact spot where she went under. According to his official statement, he spent 9 agonizing hours drifting blindly through the blackness, desperately shouting her name, completely isolated because his cell phone required a Wi-Fi connection to make calls. He claimed he was at the absolute mercy of a brutal current that slowly pushed him miles away from the initial location, eventually washing ashore at 4 in the morning at the Marsh Harbor Boat Yard, where he finally raised the alarm. It was a story of a freak maritime accident, a sequence of terrible coincidences that robbed a devoted husband of his wife of 25 years. But an explosive breakthrough in the investigation has completely shattered the foundation of this timeline, and it comes directly from the transcript of Edward Smith, the overnight guard who was actually on duty at the boatyard the exact moment Brian stepped out of the darkness and onto dry land. Think about that for a moment, because what the security guard observed does not just tweak the edges of Brian's story, it completely appends it. When federal investigators from the Coast Guard Investigative Service and local Bahamian police sat down with Edward Smith, they uncovered details that had never been made public, details that flatly contradict the physical and geographical reality of that night. According to the guard's official statement, when Brian arrived at the boatyard at 4 in the morning, he was not a man who had just spent 9 hours trapped in a drifting dinghy, battling high waves and open ocean currents. Instead, the guard distinctly notes that Brian arrived at the facility on foot, walking into the well-lit area from a completely different direction than the docks. When Brian begged for water and began explaining that his wife had gone overboard, the guard asked the most logical question anyone would ask in that horrific moment. When exactly did this happen? Brian's response to the guard was immediate, and it is a detail that changes everything we thought we knew about this case. He told Edward Smith that Lynette had fallen into the water at approximately 7 o'clock in the evening. Stay with me, because this is where it gets incredibly complicated. In every single television interview Brian has given since that night, and in every subsequent statement to his lawyers and friends, he has firmly stated that the accident occurred closer to 8 o'clock, emphasizing that it was pitch black, making it impossible to see where Lynette was swimming or where the current was carrying her. But if the timeline he gave to the security guard is the truth, the entire premise of his defense dissolves. In the Bahamas in early April, 7 o'clock is not pitch black. In fact, astronomical data confirms that at 7 in the evening, the sun has barely dipped below the horizon, leaving the Sea of Abaco bathed in full, clear twilight. This is where things get serious, because a 1-hour discrepancy is not a simple mistake made by a grieving, traumatized mind. It is a fundamental restructuring of physical reality. If Lynette went overboard at 7 o'clock, she did so in plain view of a highly populated harbor, in an area surrounded by other moored vessels, and during a time when visibility across the water would have been nearly perfect. Why would a husband claim it was too dark to see his wife if the sky was still bright enough to navigate by eye? The security guard's transcript reveals that the contradictions began accumulating within the very first minutes of Brian reaching safety. When the guard questioned how a simple trip from the restaurant to the Abaco and back to their anchored 46-foot sailboat, Soulmate, could have resulted in a 9-hour delay, Brian's explanation began to shift right before the guard's eyes. He told Smith that the wind was incredibly powerful and that the dinghy had rapidly drifted away from Lynette, but then he added a detail that he would later omit from every other official version of his story. He claimed that as he drifted away, he could actually see Lynette swimming. Furthermore, he claimed she was swimming north, directly toward Hope Town, and that she was carrying a yellow bag. Ask yourself why that detail matters so much. In later accounts given to rescue personnel and friends, Brian stated that the dry bag Lynette had been holding simply sank or floated away, and that he had lost sight of her almost instantly. More importantly, family members have confirmed that Lynette's personal dry bag was not yellow at all. It was a bright, neon green. The yellow dry bag belonged exclusively to Brian. The presence of the bag and the shifting directions of Lynette's alleged swim are pieces of a puzzle that simply refuse to fit together. Brian told the night guard she was swimming north toward Hope Town, but in text sent to friends just days later, he claimed she was swimming south toward their anchored sailboat. To local rescue volunteers, he stated she was swimming westward toward the nearest shoreline. 3 completely different directions, described by the only witness to her disappearance, all within a matter of days. The night guard, Edward Smith, noted his own immediate sense of disbelief as he listened to Brian speak that morning. The boatyard where Brian arrived is a massive, highly visible commercial facility with towering floodlights that can be seen from miles out on the water. Brian admitted to the guard that he could see those bright lights from at least 150 yards away while he was still out on the water, yet instead of paddling directly toward the illumination and safety, he reportedly altered his course, bypassed the obvious landing area, and somehow ended up walking into the facility on foot from a dark, unlit perimeter. To understand just how troubling this detail is, one has to look at the actual geography of the Abaco coastline surrounding that boatyard. The areas directly adjacent to the commercial facility are not clear sand beaches. They are thick, tangled labyrinths of dense mangroves, sharp limestone rock, and heavy tropical scrub. Local experts, including Jim Todd of the Hopetown Volunteer Fire and Rescue Team, have pointed out that navigating that specific terrain on foot in the dead of night, at 4 in the morning, would be an almost impossible feat for someone who was truly exhausted and disoriented. It would have required hours of brutal physical hacking through an absolute wall of vegetation in total darkness. What do you believe actually happened in those missing 9 hours between the restaurant and the boatyard? Do you think a 1-hour timeline discrepancy can be explained away by shock, or is it evidence of a calculated attempt to construct a narrative after the fact? Drop your thoughts and theories in the comments below, because looking at the sequence of events through the lens of this newly exposed security transcript changes the entire scope of the investigation. As we dig deeper into what happened after Brian knocked on that boatyard door, the physical evidence left behind on their primary vessel, Soulmate, begins to speak a language of its own, a language that digital forensics experts are now using to reconstruct the final hours of Lynette Hooker's life. The Coast Guard Investigative Service recently took the massive step of officially seizing the 46-foot Morgan sloop, towing it 40 miles offshore from where it was floating and impounding it at a high-security federal station in Fort Pierce, Florida. Federal agents have yellow-taped the entire perimeter of the vessel, designating it a full-scale crime scene, and have been seen systematically carrying heavy evidence bags out of the cabin day after day. This level of intense federal intervention tells us that investigators are no longer treating this as a simple missing persons case at sea. They are looking for something highly specific, and according to sources close to the operation, the items they recovered from the boat are exactly what they were hoping to find. Live-aboard sailors like Brian and Lynette do not just travel, they live within a complex digital ecosystem. Their sailboat was outfitted with state-of-the-art electronic logging systems, smart technology, and a powerful Starlink satellite antenna mounted high on the mast. This digital footprint is what investigators call the silent witness, because unlike human memory, data does not shift, it does not panic, and it does not change its story depending on who is asking the questions. The Starlink unit on the mast of the Soulmate is particularly devastating to Brian's timeline. These modern satellite arrays maintain continuous, highly detailed connection logs of any personal device, such as smartphones, tablets, or smartwatches, that come within their wireless radius. Brian has vigorously maintained that after Lynette fell from the dinghy, he was trapped over 1,000 yards away, unable to get anywhere near the primary sailboat because he had no motor power. But if the digital logs of that Starlink antenna show that Brian's phone, or more importantly, Lynette's devices, pinged the router or connected to the onboard network during those critical hours of the night, it means the dinghy did make it back to the Soulmate. It means the entire story of being trapped at sea, drifting helplessly for 9 hours with a single oar, is a complete fabrication. The electronics on a modern vessel log everything from exact minutes the house batteries experienced a power draw to the precise coordinates of the GPS units, and federal investigators are currently running a microscopic forensic analysis on every single byte of data recovered from those seized devices. This case is developing at an incredible pace, and if you want to stay informed on every new piece of evidence and every breakthrough as it happens, please take a brief second to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because stories like Lynette's require persistent, dedicated attention to ensure the truth is never buried. Let us continue into the most baffling piece of physical evidence found inside the cabin of the Soulmate, an item that directly challenges the idea that Lynette ever vanished into the open ocean from the back of that dinghy. The discovery that has left local search volunteers and federal investigators in a state of absolute shock is the physical recovery of Lynette's personal Apple Watch. In multiple photographs and social media updates posted by the couple just hours before she vanished, including snapshots taken during their final afternoon at Tahiti Beach and their evening at the Abaco Inn, Lynette is clearly and unmistakably wearing her smartwatch, attached to a distinct, powder-pink athletic band. Yet, when agents from the Coast Guard Investigative Service executed their federal search warrant and boarded the impounded sailboat, Soulmate, at the station in Fort Pierce, Florida, they found that exact pink watch sitting completely dry inside the cabin of the primary vessel. Think about the sheer logistical impossibility of that detail for a moment. According to Brian's official narrative, Lynette plummeted off the back of the moving dinghy 1,000 yards away from the sailboat, plunged into the deep, turbulent waters of the harbor, and was immediately swept away by a brutal, fast-moving current before he could ever reach her. If she fell into the ocean while wearing the watch, there is absolutely no logical or straightforward explanation for how that highly personal tracking device ended up safely unbuckled and resting inside the secure living quarters of the sailboat. It is a piece of evidence that completely breaks the spine of the accident narrative, suggesting instead that Lynette, or at the very least her personal belongings, returned to the Soulmate after leaving the restaurant that evening. Stay with me because this is where the digital forensic puzzle gets even more complicated and far more sinister. Modern smartwatches do not just tell time, they act as highly sophisticated biometric and geographic black boxes. They are constantly tracking heart rate, skin temperature, ambient movement, step counts, and precise GPS location coordinates. Even if a watch is not actively connected to a cellular network or a local Wi-Fi signal, its internal memory continues to log every single heartbeat and physical movement with exact, microsecond timestamps. If Lynette's watch was resting inside the cabin, investigators are now aggressively working to determine the exact minute it stopped recording biometric data from a human wrist. If the internal sensors show that her heart rate spiked or ceased while the watch's GPS coordinates placed it directly on board the sailboat, rather than out in the open water of the channel, the entire framework of Brian's defense collapses. The data trail left behind by these connected devices is notoriously difficult to erase or alter, and in modern criminal investigations, it is often these silent digital records that prove decisive when human testimony begins to fracture under scrutiny. This brings us directly to another deeply troubling development involving Brian's own electronic footprint and the strange text messages he sent in the frantic days following the disappearance. In an effort to explain his movements to the local search parties, Brian sent several text messages to Jim Todd of the Hopetown Volunteer Fire and Rescue Team. Attached to those messages were highly detailed, hand-drawn style digital maps illustrating the precise path Brian claimed his dinghy had drifted during those 9 missing hours, along with an X marking the exact location where he alleged Lynette had fallen overboard into the waves. It seemed like the proactive action of a desperate husband trying to assist local authorities. However, a massive breakthrough by digital researchers and independent forensic analysts has revealed that these maps were not generated by a standard navigation application or a traditional marine charting tool. Instead, they were artificially created using Google's Gemini AI tool, generated while Brian's device was actively connected to a stable Wi-Fi network. Ask yourself why that detail matters. If a man is floating helplessly in a dark harbor, fighting for survival with a single oar, he does not have access to a stable Wi-Fi connection to prompt an artificial intelligence assistant. The mapping data was constructed after the fact, leaving a definitive digital trail on Google's servers. The realization that Brian utilized advanced AI tools to construct visual representations of his alleged drift trajectory has forced investigators to ask a far broader and more deeply unsettling question. What else was Gemini used for, and when? In countless modern criminal trials, a suspect's search and query history has proven to be the most devastating evidence a prosecutor can present. Seeing a sequence of highly specific incriminating searches read aloud in a courtroom can seal the outcome of a case before a jury ever begins deliberations. Federal agents are now using legal channels to pull the complete, unedited account history associated with every device connected to the Hooker household. They are looking to see if queries were made regarding local tidal patterns, deep water geography, the density of nearby mangrove swamps, or methods for disabling marine tracking equipment. If the logs reveal that these searches were conducted in the days or hours leading up to Lynette's disappearance, or during the mysterious 9-hour window before Brian arrived at the boatyard, it would provide the critical element of premeditation that transforms a tragic maritime accident into something far more severe. What do you believe the recovery of Lynette's watch inside the cabin indicates about the true sequence of events that night? Do Do you think the use of AI tools to generate drift maps is a sign of a husband trying to visualize a confusing trauma, or is it a calculated attempt to mislead the search parties? Drop your theories in the comments below, because your perspective on how these pieces connect is vital as we analyze a case where the official story seems to change with every passing week. The deeper investigators look into Brian's behavior that morning, the more the physical realities of the Bahamian landscape begin to reject his story. When the Hopetown Volunteer Fire and Rescue Crew finally pulled Brian out of the boatyard and brought him on board their rescue vessel to begin an immediate search of the area, multiple crew members noticed highly unusual discrepancies regarding the equipment Brian was carrying. According to Edward Smith, the night guard, when Brian first walked out of the darkness at 4 in the morning, he was carrying a single bright yellow dry bag. Yet, when Brian stepped onto the rescue boat just an hour later, Jim Todd and 2 other emergency responders distinctly recall him carrying a royal blue or aqua-colored dry bag. This color discrepancy might seem minor at first glance, a simple misremembering by individuals operating under high stress in the early hours of the morning. But dry bags are completely opaque, solid pieces of heavy-duty material. One cannot be mistaken for another based on its contents showing through. What makes this detail truly chilling is what one of the rescue crew members observed when they finally navigated back to the anchored sailboat, Soulmate, that morning. As the rescue boat pulled alongside the massive 46-foot sloop, the crew member watched as the aqua dry bag was thrown up onto the deck of the sailboat. Brian and a local Bahamian police officer then boarded the vessel and went completely below deck, remaining inside the cabin for approximately 1 full hour while the rescue crew waited outside. When Brian finally emerged from the cabin to continue the search for his missing wife, he walked away without that blue dry bag, leaving it behind in the secure interior of the boat. That bag, along with whatever contents were hidden inside it during those critical hours, is now potentially sitting in a federal evidence vault in Florida. Investigators are working to determine if the bag contained the missing keys, the second door, or perhaps the real electronic devices that hold the unvarnished truth of what transpired in the dark. Let us move forward into the strange evidence regarding the vessel's heavy diving equipment, a detail that introduces an entirely new and terrifying theory to the investigation. The investigation took a sharp technical turn when independent researchers and digital forensic experts began analyzing a social media update posted by Lynette Hooker on April 2nd, just 48 hours before she disappeared into the Bahamian night. In that specific post, Lynette casually mentioned heading to Great Guana Cay to get their heavy scuba diving tanks filled with fresh oxygen. At first glance, it seemed like a completely mundane detail of live-aboard cruiser life, a routine errand for a couple who spent their retirement exploring the reefs of the Caribbean. However, when investigators cross-referenced the social media post with the automated identification system tracking data and the global navigation logs from the Soulmate, they confirmed that the vessel was indeed docked at Great Guana Cay on that exact date, and that 2 massive high-capacity scuba tanks had been freshly filled to maximum pressure. Think about that for a moment, because what makes this detail so incredibly suspicious is what investigators found when they finally executed their search warrant and inspected the diving equipment locker on board the impounded sailboat. There was absolutely no record, no logbook entry, and no personal testimony indicating that either Brian or Lynette had gone recreational diving on April 3rd or April 4th. Yet, when agents measured the internal air pressure of those freshly filled tanks, they discovered a massive, unexplained discrepancy. Stay with me because this is where the physical reality of the case introduces an entirely new and deeply unsettling theory. One of the primary oxygen tanks, specifically the one mapped to Brian's personal gear setup, was heavily depleted. If the tanks were filled on April 2nd and no recreational dives were conducted before Lynette vanished on the night of April 4th, when, where, and why was that oxygen used? This discovery has forced federal investigators from the Coast Guard Investigative Service to look beyond the surface of the shallow harbor and consider a far more calculated scenario. Lynette's diving setup was highly advanced, featuring a specialized weight-integrated buoyancy control vest. This type of modern vest does not utilize a traditional, easily identifiable external weight belt. Instead, the heavy lead ballast weights are slid directly into secure, internal zippered pockets built into the fabric of the vest itself. If a person were to enter the water wearing a weight-integrated vest with a ballast fully loaded, their natural buoyancy would be completely compromised, making it physically impossible to float or swim to the surface without actively releasing those internal pockets. Investigators are now conducting a microscopic examination of the diving locker to determine if Lynette's integrated weights are fully accounted for, or if they are completely missing from the vessel's inventory. The depletion of the scuba tank has fueled a powerful alternative theory among local maritime experts who know the treacherous geography of the Abaco Islands. The anchorage site where the soulmate was moored sits on the protected, relatively calm side of Elbow Cay, where the water is incredibly shallow, ranging from a mere 4 feet to 15 feet at its absolute deepest point. The visibility in this specific harbor is notoriously pristine, resembling a clear swimming pool where the sandy bottom is easily visible from the deck of a boat, even in low-light conditions. Local search parties, dive teams, and volunteer rescue personnel who systematically swept this entire anchorage area within hours of the report have universally stated that if Lynette had gone overboard where Brian claimed, her body or her bright green clothing would have been spotted almost instantly. Because of this geographic reality, investigators are now exploring the possibility that scuba equipment may have been utilized during those 9 missing hours to access the Atlantic side of the island. The ocean side of Elbow Cay is completely different from the calm anchorage. It is a brutal high-energy coastline dominated by crashing waves, jagged barrier reefs, deep underwater trenches, and powerful offshore rip currents that drag everything out into the open, unforgiving Atlantic. This is where things get serious, because accessing that violent ocean side by a small underpowered 8-foot dinghy in the pitch blackness of night would be an act of absolute suicide. The 8-knot winds and massive coastal swells would have flipped a small plastic tender instantly. But an experienced diver, equipped with a full tank of oxygen and heavy ballast weights, could easily navigate those shallow reef passages from underwater, completely invisible to any onlookers on the shore or nearby vessels. Ask yourself why someone would go to such extreme, dangerous lengths in the middle of the night. If an individual needed to transport something heavy out past the shallow, crystal-clear sanctuary of the harbor and into a deep, fast-moving ocean current where it would never be recovered, utilizing a pre-filled scuba tank would be the perfect, silent logistical solution. It is a theory that bridges the gap between the pristine shallow waters where Lynette allegedly fell and the absolute lack of physical evidence found by the search teams. The credibility of Brian's accident narrative depends entirely on the idea that the ocean current was simply too strong for him to find her, but the local experts have completely rejected that premise, stating firmly that the harbor currents that night simply do not move in a direction that would carry a person out of the bay undetected. Do you believe the depleted scuba tank is the smoking gun that proves a second hidden maritime operation took place during those 9 missing hours? Or could there be a reasonable undocumented explanation for the lost air pressure? How do you feel about the local experts declaring that Lynette absolutely would have been found if she had gone overboard in the shallow anchorage? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because this case has turned into a fascinating battle between a husband's shifting words and the cold, unyielding laws of oceanography. As the pressure builds on Brian Hooker, every single mechanical detail of their secondary equipment is being brought into the light, and the findings are raising massive warning flags for the Bahamian authorities who currently hold his small dinghy in secure custody. A critical piece of evidence that has recently emerged involves the dinghy's outboard propulsion system. In the weeks leading up to the trip, Lynette had been actively texting her close friend Marn, expressing intense frustration over their old, unreliable torpedo outboard engine, which was constantly stalling and failing to start. In those text exchanges, Lynette happily shared that they had finally purchased a brand new, highly efficient electric outboard motor, a cutting-edge NT300 model, specifically to ensure they wouldn't get stranded in the harbor at night. Photographic evidence recovered from Great Guana Cay confirms that this new electric NT300 engine was securely mounted to the transom of their dinghy just 2 days before the disappearance. This matters immensely because Brian's entire defense relies on the claim that his engine instantly died and refused to restart because the safety lanyard was pulled away. Forensic mechanics are now examining the impounded dinghy to verify a highly specific and terrifying detail: which engine was actually bolted to the back of the boat when Brian washed ashore at the boatyard. If the brand new reliable electric engine was bypassed, and the old malfunctioning torpedo engine was mysteriously reinstalled right before the fateful evening, it would destroy any claim of a sudden, unexpected mechanical failure. Switching back to an old, broken engine immediately after installing a pristine upgrade makes absolutely no logical sense for a tech enthusiast who prioritizes safety, unless someone deliberately required a motor that could be blamed for failing. The digital and mechanical trails are converging on the soulmate, and as federal prosecutors prepare their next moves, the final piece of the puzzle shifts back to the shore, where the shifting descriptions of Brian's physical behavior are painting a picture that no court of law can ignore. Let us proceed into the final explosive chapter of this digital trail to see the evidence that might ultimately break this mystery wide open. The final, most haunting piece of the physical puzzle comes down to a detail that initially seemed like a simple background observation, but has since become a major point of discussion among forensic experts tracking the case. Following Lynette's disappearance, Brian Hooker sat down for high-profile, televised interviews with major national networks, including ABC, NBC, and CBS, to plead for help and detail his version of that tragic night. As the cameras zoomed in during these emotional sit-downs, sharp-eyed observers and independent researchers immediately noticed a distinct visual detail. Brian's fingernails appear to have significant amounts of dark embedded debris underneath them, resembling thick dirt or soil. In the hyper-analyzed world of true crime investigations, this small detail immediately ignited intense speculation. Think about that for a moment, because according to Brian's timeline, he had spent his final hours before the disappearance relaxing on the pristine white sands of Tahiti Beach and dining at the Abaco Inn, followed by a 9-hour ordeal floating in the clean, saltwater environment of the harbor. Saltwater acts as a natural solvent, rapidly cleaning skin and flushing out debris from beneath the nails. The presence of thick, dark residue suggested to many that Brian had been engaged in heavy, physical manual labor, potentially involving digging or moving earth, shortly before raising the alarm at the boatyard. Stay with me because this is where the narrative requires a careful balance between suspicion and medical fact, a nuance that defines high-level investigative journalism. While the visual evidence of the fingernails caused a massive wave of public outrage and speculation, a deeper dive into the couple's personal history provided a much more straightforward, medically documented explanation. Records show that Brian suffered from a severe, long-standing fungal nail infection that had migrated from his feet to his hands, a chronic condition that naturally causes the nail bed to thicken, discolor, and accumulate organic debris that mimics embedded soil. In fact, text messages recovered from Lynette's phone showed that just a week prior to the trip, she had affectionately purchased a bottle of Benjamin's Healing Oil, a traditional Caribbean topical treatment, specifically to help her husband treat the embarrassing condition before they went out into public spaces. This detail is incredibly revealing, not because it proves guilt, but because it shines a rare, gentle light on Lynette's true character as a deeply caring, attentive partner who looked after the smallest details of her husband's life. It also serves as a critical warning to the public that in complex investigations, what looks like an obvious clue on television can often have a completely innocent medical reality behind it. But while the fingernail evidence may dissolve under medical scrutiny, the unyielding laws of time and satellite data continue to close in on Brian's shifting narrative. The Coast Guard Investigative Service and Bahamian authorities have now spent over 5 consecutive weeks methodically building a digital and physical fortress around this case. The decision to seize a massive 46-foot Morgan sloop from 40 miles offshore and declare it a federal crime scene is an extraordinary high-resource maneuver that is never executed on a whim or a simple hunch. It requires a solid foundation of probable cause, reviewed and signed off by federal judges who recognize that the digital logs contained within the Soulmate were simply too valuable to leave exposed to potential alteration or loss. Every single day that agents spend inside that impounded hull, removing evidence bags, downloading router histories, and running forensic algorithms on the smart devices, they are bridging the gap between what Brian claimed happened and what the silent data proves did happen. As it stands today, Brian Hooker has not been charged with a single crime in relation to his wife's disappearance, and under the law, he remains entirely innocent until proven guilty in a court of justice. Yet, the sheer volume of contradictions exposed by the night guard's transcript, the geographic impossibility of the 9-hour drift in a pristine 4-foot harbor, the recovery of Lynette's dry and undamaged Apple Watch inside the secure cabin, the artificial generation of drift maps using Google's Gemini AI, and the mysterious depletion of the scuba tanks have created a web of inconsistency that grows tighter with every passing week. The waters of the Sea of Abaco have refused to give up Lynette Hooker, but the digital trail she left behind on her wrists, on the boat's mast, and in the server logs of the modern world may ultimately step forward to tell the true story of her final hours. This investigation is far from over, and new details are breaking every single day as the federal forensic labs complete their analysis of the Soulmate's black box electronics. What do you believe is the single most damning piece of evidence uncovered in this update? And do you think the digital trail will be enough for prosecutors to bring an official resolution to this mystery? Drop your final theories and thoughts in the comments below, because your engagement helps keep Lynette's story active and ensures that the search for accountability never fades into the background. If you believe this investigation deserves maximum public visibility and want to follow every breaking update as the forensic data is released, please share this video across your social platforms, hit the like button, and subscribe to the channel right now, because we will be tracking this case every single step of the way until the absolute truth is finally brought to light.